Welcome everybody on this hot afternoon in the UK, and thank you all for joining. I can see that there are some people still coming in, but we will kick off as we have a very hard finish today. Our topic this afternoon is the chair as Chief Reputation Officer, and many thanks to Sir Peter Gershon for the title. It's a topic that's provoked a lot of interest, both in today's audience and those who've subscribed for the recording. And it's a theme, implicitly, we all know the chair has a very strong interest and responsibility for reputational issues, but the practicalities and the explicit practice of this is something that's clearly very much on the board agenda. And so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today three very experienced chairs, Ruth Cairnie, Sir Ian Davis and Sir Peter Gershon, who will be able to talk us through some of the practicalities of the role of the chair with regard to reputation. And if we click to our next chart, please. Our agenda today, and we will be finishing promptly at on the top of the hour, a little bit of background on reputation and trust, followed by, and this is the sort of the very important part, insights from the chair, and then opening up to your questions from the floor. And then we'll conclude with some practical takeaways, as I know most of you are either sitting on boards or working with boards. And I should add, as you've seen, that this is being recorded. But also, if you have questions at any point, please do use the Q&A function, and we'll endeavour to answer them in the course of this webinar. Next chart, please. So our locus on this topic is very much board effectiveness, and I think what we've seen, particularly in the past 12 to 18 months, is within, for example, board evaluations, a real focus on the role of the chair and the practice of reputation and the management and the handling of reputational risk. As I said, this is something that's always been implicit, but is becoming perhaps more explicit. The preemptive role of building trust, stakeholder engagement, board composition, all these themes are very much on the agenda. And this was really one of the prompts for us to think about this as a topic for today's webinar. And I think if we look at the background as to what's driving this, if we could look at the next chart, please. The public mood, is very, very, being fed a diet of strong criticism of business. And we're seeing in many, many contexts, from an ESG context, from a regulatory failure context, from a competition context, the board and companies are very much in the foreground. And so there's a strong sort of background of a public mood that's wary perhaps of the role of boards. If we click onto the next chart, please. And equally, we can see this translating into both regulatory scrutiny, and here in the UK, we're currently conducting a consultation which will give much stronger regulatory powers with regard to boards. But also, if you look at the work, for example, of Edelman and the Trust Barometer, while in fact corporate reputation has risen during COVID, if you look at and these are the words that are used, the spokespeople in terms of the CEO or the board of directors, their reputation and the trust in these roles has declined. And so we have a background that's very wary of the role of the board. And so if we take that into context, I think our topic is very relevant. Before we come to our speakers, I'd like to turn to the audience. If we could click to the next chart. And we have a poll question. Who is the custodian of corporate reputation? Is it the CEO, the Chief Communications Director, the chair of the Audit Committee, or the Chief Risk Officer? And if we could just open the the poll. I'm afraid our panelists can't vote, but sadly, but I think you'll be able to give your opinion when we come to the discussion. So that's quite interesting. I think the chair wins by a whisker, 57%, well, quite a big whisker, followed by the CEO at almost 40%. And interestingly, the chief risk officer at 4%. So I'll lodge that with our panel, perhaps to come back on their views on this subject. And if we could click to the next chart, please. So we've invited 3 very experienced chairs to join us today and to really share their views on the role of the chair with regard to reputation. And I'm going to kick off by asking each of the chairs a very specific question, and then we'll open up to the floor. And I'd like to start with Sir Peter Gershon. And I should add that I think we've shared biographies with you, and they are in the charts that we'll circulate afterwards as well. Peter, the title is your title. I was asking your opinion and thinking through some issues on the chair and risk and reputational risk, and this was part of your response. And so, just to open the discussion today, how and why do you see the chair as Chief Reputation Officer? What is your thinking? And please share with us your view on the chair as Chief Reputation Officer. Welcome.
So thank you, Gillian. So first I should say that when I use the word chief, I mean it in the sense of highest or overriding. So I would say that, I mean, certainly for me, I realise sort of that how I've approached my various chairmanships has been partly influenced by some of my previous career experiences when in my executive life. One I learned, which really I learned when I did my period in the public sector in the early 2000s, and it was drummed into me at a course I went on, at which Alistair Campbell, who was then Blair's communications director, was speaking, was about the importance of looking through at sensitive issues and whether they pass the so-called Daily Mail sniff test, i.e. how would this be written up in the Daily Mail, and would it basically pass or fail? The other thing I sort of learnt even earlier in my career, when I did a number of jobs where I ran major suppliers to the public sector, and when I took over one of these suppliers, I went to see the procurement director of my most important customer. I'd never worked in this particular industry before, and I said to him, well, what do you think about this company X? And he said, do you really want to know? And I said, yes. And he said, well, basically, every time we have a meeting with representatives of your company, we count the spoons after you've left the room. Because whatever the customer regarded one of the core competence, if not the core competence of this company, as its ability to commercially negotiate, and was regarded as being very, very commercially astute. It wasn't very good at actually meeting its delivery promises and commitments, but its commercial astuteness was in the sort of the Premier League. Which sort of could say about the quote, which I think is particularly important in a B2C environment, about a B2B environment, about, well, what do they actually say about you and your company when you're not in the room? Because sometimes it is very different to what people say about your company to your face. So let me give you a few examples and of why I've sort of come to this view about the chair as the Chief Reputation Officer. There are times when issues come to the boardroom which they've gone through innumerable levels of the company. They've been very well thought through. The logic is impeccable. but it doesn't pass the sniff test. I mean, as this is under Chatham House rules, let me give an example, which was around when the government introduced all the sort of emergency funding for businesses as a part of the COVID emergency measures back in spring 20. The issue arose as to whether National Grid should take advantage of these facilities because the money was really, really cheap. And the logic of doing it was impeccable, but it didn't pass the sniff test. For a regulated monopoly that did not need the money, it was not the right thing to do to take it. And so we didn't. Secondly, there are issues where occasionally in the boardroom, decisions come forward where it is not at all obvious how the board should act in a way that is consistent with the company's values. Because there may be multiple options, all of which are consistent with the values, but at the end, because the decision can be very public, it has to be made about which is actually the one that is most likely to resonate with the company's values. And there, in my experience, is the chairman has to act as the catalyst for trying to ensure the board makes the best possible decision. And the thought I would give is where management has, in my experience as a chairman, underestimated the reputational consequences of a course of action it either is pursuing or wants to pursue, at which point I think I've always felt the need then to intervene, to be clear about, to ensure that the company does respond appropriately. Because, as the charts Gillian showed at the beginning made clear, reputation, is absolutely key. And that was certainly true if you're a public regulated monopoly. Reputation is everything. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Peter. A lot of food for thought there. And I think the sniff test is something that's very well understood and clearly internalized. And I would like to come back on some of the judgments that you were talking about as chair. But nextly, I'd like to turn to Ian. And Ian, I wonder if we could, if we look at this experience and some of the roles that you're fulfilling now, two things come across very clearly: the international nature and also the breadth of sectors. And I'd be very interested in your perspective as chair. How does this change across sectors, across geographies? Are there different considerations that are brought to mind? I'd also be, by the way, very interested in any response to the poll question, whether the 57% was correct that the chair is Chief Reputation Officer or otherwise. So welcome, Ian.
Okay, well, thanks, Gillian, and hello to everyone on the call. Just a few comments from me on the topic, and particular on the Chief Reputation Officer. I'm not surprised at the poll response. I think one of the problems with reputation is it is so diffuse in terms of reputation for what, that I think it must involve the management and a bit the board. And whilst, Peter, I understand exactly where you're coming from, the chairman as Chief Reputation Officer, I think one of the difficulties with reputation is that it covers so many parts of the company. And I personally think that one of the challenges of the board and the management is to break down reputation into two questions. One is reputation for what? And the second is reputation with who? For many companies, reputation really doesn't matter very much, except with employees and possibly investors. For others, like a national utility, or Johnson & Johnson in the US is a good example, which is an iconic healthcare company, you have a much broader constituent. So as I think about reputation, I think the first question is ask, for what and with whom? Is it investors? Is it suppliers? Is it employees? Is it customers? Now, you'll say all of the above, but for most companies, in reality, 2 or 3 are absolutely crucial, and the others are just nice, but they don't really matter very much. So if you take the hedge fund industry, they have a very low reputation generally in society, but they only care about their reputation with their investors. And from a commercial point of view, that's right. You could argue whether it's influencing regulation. So I do think you have to get very granular on reputation and be very specific about for what and with whom. Is it ethics? Is it fair dealing? Is it trustworthiness? Is it reliability of product? Most companies, reputation isn't a huge issue. Most companies are unheard of by most of the public. And so I think you need to be very pragmatic about it. And that's why I think it's very difficult to answer who is responsible for reputation. I think it depends. If you're National Grid, Peter, I'm sorry if I'm speaking on your behalf, I think the chairman has to get involved, but for many companies, I don't think they do. I do think, though, that if you look at the international experience, I would say that the attitude to reputation is very similar to the UK. I don't see much different. There are parts of the world where people don't really care too much about reputation, except possibly with government. But generally speaking, my experience is that the attitudes and the measurement of reputation is pretty similar across the world. It does depend hugely if you're a consumer-led business or a B2B business. It does depend hugely on how important government is. I do think government and the public is going to become more important for most companies as regulation is a bigger factor in virtually every industry. If you take Johnson & Johnson, where I'm a board director, Johnson & Johnson has a connection with consumers as a consumer brand. It's the biggest healthcare company in the world. So it has huge resonance with governments, and it has huge resonance with the scientific community, and you have to be very careful about all of those. Other companies I've been involved in, it's a very, very different picture. So Gillian, to answer your question, I think I don't see fundamental differences by sector or by attitude across the globe. I think it depends very much on where you are as a company, where your sector is, but the key question is reputation, for what and with whom, and break it down and then work out where it really matters, whether it's just nice to have or where frankly it doesn't matter very much at all.
Thank you very much. And a number of themes that we will come back to. And I just flag again, perhaps to our audience, if you do have questions, please just send them in via the Q&A function. I'd like to turn now to Ruth. And as Ruth and I were discussing in preparation for this webinar, Ruth focused very much on building resilience. And I know this is a theme that we've looked at. You know, is it possible to build up a store of sort of capital, as it were, to really ensure that you're in a stronger position should crisis come, should turbulent times come, and for all organisations they do. So Ruth, could you talk us through a little bit from your current experience, but also perhaps your prior experience, this building up resilience with regard to reputational risk? Welcome.
Sure, thanks, Gillian, and thanks very much for the invitation to join this. And thank you, Peter, for this intriguing topic, which I do think has been very thought-provoking. And when I was thinking about it, it took me back, actually, if I may just go off on a slight tangent. But you know, when I think what is reputation and why does it matter, the points you've just been raising, Ian, and I go back immediately, actually a little bit longer than the early 2000s, Peter, to the mid-1990s. So I was a Shell executive at the time of Brent Spar. And remember vividly, you know, Brent Spar, Shell's reputation at the time was absolutely founded on very strong at engineering, very strong at delivering major projects. It was all about reliability and quality. In those days, we always used to say, you can be sure of Shell. And Brent Spar was a complete shock to the whole system. And it was something where, you know, internally we thought what we were doing was absolutely technically and environmentally the right and best solution. We'd gone through every hoop in terms of engagement and stakeholder management with the regulators and so on and so on. We knew that some of the NGOs were very opposed, but on the other hand, you know, we thought, fine, but they're wrong because we are proposing the right solution, and never dreamt that, you know, that voice of the NGOs could spark that reaction amongst the public, which led to a huge issue for the whole company. And it really led to a lot of reflection on the fact that reputation is all about perception. So whatever the facts of the matter are, it is about the perception of whichever are the relevant stakeholders, and who is going to get traction on a topic. So that was a real eye-opener from that experience. Second thought is that coming to what you've shown earlier, it is, I think, much more challenging now. So, in the 25 years, first of all, what you showed, that there's this general decline in the standing and reputation and trust in business. So we don't all enjoy the sort of bank of goodwill that you might have assumed as employers, as taxpayers, as dividend payers, and so on. So there's a sort of difficult background. I think that there are more and more stakeholders, so the stakeholder universe gets more complex, and Ian, I agree that they're not all sort of equal for all companies, but there are more of them. And the third point is that I think that through social media, there's much greater risk of an issue with one stakeholder group feeding into concerns in other stakeholder groups. So I think it's become a lot more difficult. I think, why does it matter? I completely agree with the points about it depends very much what kind of business you are. So one of my roles is on the board of ABF, which is the owner of Primark, consumer brand, increasing visibility of consumers being influenced in their choices by the reputation of the brand and what they think it stands for. Whereas for business to business and business to government, I think it's very different, but those customers also care very much about the reputation of their suppliers and, are they people who they should be seen to be supporting. I do think that for all businesses, actually the impact on employees is really important. And I would say that with Brent Spa in Shell, we went from a situation where I think almost everyone in Shell would have been immensely proud to be working there, to overnight almost people not wanting to admit in public that they worked for Shell. And I do think that without that strong sense of pride in working for a business, that does definitely have long-term implications. So then quickly to the chair's role and this thing about reputational resilience and how to build that. So I think there are a number of different things which are really important. The whole point that gets so much attention about company purpose. So what does the company do? How does it do it? What does it stand for? How does that purpose drive strategy and decision making? I think for the decisions that are being taken, Peter, you talked about this, so important that you build a board so that all different angles are considered, all different aspects, thinking about the different ways a particular decision could play out. And I think about, yes, the Daily Mail test, but much more broadly as well, which groups, which stakeholders might really have an issue. And I think that's in practical terms all about the board agenda, bringing issues very early to the board for very open discussion. It's about the climate of sort of open and constructive dialogue, bringing in external perspectives. Then I think there's actually the diversity of the board that's really important. So how do you design the board so that you're more likely to get different perspectives into the debate? I think there's a lot of focus and value in really looking at stakeholders and what are their perspectives and how do we know? So not just looking at that as a page in the annual report, but the board actually engaging with the executive about how different stakeholder groups are being engaged. And the last point I wanted to raise is that I think throughout this, the culture of the company is absolutely critical. And I think that's due to the fact that especially in a world with social media, the reputation is not about how you're presenting yourself and what you're saying and talking about yourself and what your comms people do, but it's also very much about how all of your employees are showing up and whether the stories that they're creating about the company and what it stands for are positive or not. And so I think the board's role in setting the culture and then looking at how we know that the culture is what we think it should be is absolutely critical. So who is the Chief Reputation Officer? I think that the board has a critical role to play clearly on reputation, as it does on purpose, on strategy, on culture. It doesn't do the work, but it has an absolutely critical responsibility. And I think the chair's role is then key in orchestrating the board to hold those different roles and accountabilities in an effective way.
Thank you, Ruth. Very thoughtful and very structured, and clearly that resilience is hugely important. We are receiving a number of questions, and so I'm actually going to move, if I may, straight into the Q&A. So perhaps we could drop the charts and move into the Q&A session. And my first question is social media. Peter mentioned the sort of the Daily Mail sniff test, but obviously we've also moved into an era of very rapid social media. And we've got two questions which I'm going to combine, one from Damien Regent and one from Stephen Page. One aspect of social media being what your employees choose to post, and perhaps the role of the board with regard to Glassdoor and the sort of employee communication via social media. And I guess Stephen has just emphasised the speed of social media and the fact that it can be very difficult to pin down to refute assertions that are not factual. So what does the chair need to do in advance to survive a fact-free crisis at Twitter speed? So if I could bring those two social media questions together in the first instance and open it. Perhaps, Peter, I know you did talk about social media when we were preparing for this. So if I can perhaps start with you and then open to the other chairs.
So my direct of social media was that some of the audience in the UK may recollect that in August 2019, there was a very significant power outage in the UK, which happened late on a Friday afternoon. And one of the consequences of it was that a whole bunch of commuter trains coming out of King's Cross got stuck on the railway lines because they couldn't cope with the transient failure in the power, and hundreds of thousands of people are trapped at King's Cross when all they want to do is or in trains when all they want to do is get home and have a barbecue in the back garden. So you can, in those circumstances, I mean, the onslaught we got in social media was just off the scale. The trouble was, for a period of time, we did not know what the real cause of the problem were. There appeared to be multiple things going on. So, I mean, when we did the investigation afterwards, I think we found, you know, what could we actually have put out that would have nailed this thing dead before it took off? And I'm not convinced there was anything we could do. What we did know after a period of time was actually the grid itself behaved exactly in the way it was supposed to behave. The deal was two major power stations have been taken out by lightning strikes, and the insurance premium that we're allowed to carry, which ultimately is recovered from all consumers, is you have to be able to cover in hot standby the loss of the biggest generator on the system, not the loss of two generators on the system at the same time. Coupled with that was the issue was actually there was a software fault in these trains, which was actually nothing to do with grid. So we knew after a short period of time that sooner or later the truth would out, and that this actually was not a crisis, it was a frenzy. And over time, the reputational damage that we had suffered on social media would abate, but we just had to recognize it was going to take time, but it would in the end abate when the results of various reviews became public knowledge. And indeed, that is what happened. But I think it is an old lesson that when social media attacks you, the speed with which it happens, I mean, firstly, it's totally out of kilter with any normal processes in a large, complex organization. And secondly, you have to be, if you're going to put something out to try to rebut it, you have to be really, really confident that you have got hard data you can use to rebut. If you haven't, and you put something out which subsequently turns out is not to be correct, I mean, then you have just magnified the problem even worse. So I think you have to recognize the need is to get the facts as soon as possible, and then to start working on the process. I mean, clearly, if it had been our fault, and there was an incident in 2004, which ultimately turned out to be Grid's fault, then I think these days you just have to cough up and say, we got it wrong.
Thank you. Ian or Ruth, would you like to add anything on social media? Ian.
I think Peter makes a very good point. I think one of the jobs of a board and top management is distinguish between an embarrassment, a frenzy, and a crisis. It's quite rare for that to be a crisis through social media. If it's a crisis, it will usually get into the mainstream media and become a source of discussion. As we know, social media is dominated by the angries and fanatics, and whilst you should not ignore it and you should monitor it carefully, generally speaking, social media is embarrassing, with one exception, which I'll come on to. And it's one of the jobs of the board and the processes of management is distinguish between an irritation and some of the things that Pete described. If you run a big company, stuff is going to happen, some bit bad. That doesn't make it into a reputational crisis, particularly as people getting more used to social media being dominated by the angry. So generally speaking, my experience is if it's a real crisis, it's broad scale and it's sustained over time. If it's an event, it usually goes away. If it's a series of events, then it becomes a problem. So I think one of the biggest things is to overreact to social media, not ignore it, but overreaction. So generally speaking, a real crisis is sustained over time, gets mass attention, gets the scrutiny of Parliament, TV, and all the rest of it. Otherwise, it's just an embarrassment. And I think it's important, particularly if you're a prominent company, that people want to bash, which is virtually everybody these days, that distinguish that. The one exception of that on social media is when there's a personal attack against management. And you're seeing this in the technology field where employees, interestingly, other employees are attacking the integrity or the behavior of the senior management on social media. That can turn into a crisis very quickly. And we're seeing that in California a lot. So if there's one area I'd be really, really ears up immediately, it's when there's an attack on the integrity of management.
Thank you. Ruth, I don't know if you wanted to add something. Yeah.
Well, I very much agree with the points made. I think that it's not about crisis, but I do think that it's important to be aware of ongoing social media sort of negative comments, particularly in a consumer facing business, because I do think that that is an important part of, or an increasingly important contributor to the reputation of the brand. And so knowing what's happening and then thinking of what the measures are, if as necessary, to counter negative messaging that's out there on social media, I think is very important. And it's not at all about going out and trying to get into a Twitter war, because that's just a disaster. You just have to build the elements and awareness of the qualities that you want the brand to stand for, and create more resilience in that way. And I do think that understand and having an awareness of what's on social media from the employee side as part of the overall awareness of what do employees in this company really think about it, I think is also very important.
Thank you. And we are receiving a lot of questions on other topics, but I just wanted to expand on this a little bit. Where do you as chairs turn to for sort of advice, a sounding board on issues like this? Is it your internal team, your comms team? This is a slightly broader question perhaps than social media, but obviously on reputational risk, arguably there could be a risk relying heavily on the company. So I'd just be interested, one question, how do you form your opinion? How do you ensure that you're accessing the sources that you need to as chair on reputational issues? I open that up to whoever would like to. Ruth, would you like to kick off?
I think first of all, very much the internal team. So we have, I mean, as I said, I think that this is a very sort of multifaceted issue, and so really understanding the views and getting all the inputs of the internal team is essential. And then we have lots of advisors, so getting their views on issues, bouncing things off them is important. And then network of trusted people to reach out to and discuss difficult issues. And
presumably sort of independent voices as well. There might be times when, yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Peter.
I totally agree with Ruth. I can't add anything to the excellent point she's already made.
Thank you. And can I just ask on the internal, obviously the CEO will build a team of, which will typically comprise a corporate affairs director or a communications director, if you're a quoted company, an IR director. To what extent do you as chair just sort of keep an eye on the quality of the engagement with key stakeholders? Ian, can I turn to you for...
Yes, well, virtually all the companies I've been involved in do monitor, and surveys is a big factor. So internal, virtually every company now does employee surveys, and they survey attitudes and moods. Virtually every company monitors its helplines and looks at themes and complaints. And every company I work for has a facility to monitor social media comment and dialogue. So, and usually that is sent every month, sometimes every 3 months. And every board I've been involved in once a year would review the processes for monitoring the reputation amongst key stakeholders. And surveys is a big source of data, and sometimes you might get external in. So it's doing what a board would normally do, using data and sometimes external input to monitor the reputational risks that really matter, not the ones that don't really matter. And I would distinguish a short-term crisis or embarrassment from the fundamental.
Thank you.
Could I add something to that, Gillian? Because I think, if you mentioned corporate affairs, Ian's talked about people, you talked about IR. I mean, it seems to me on all of those, and in general, how does a board conduct its business? I mean, it's about reviewing process for how things are managed, as Ian's just said. It's about then getting regular updates. So an update on investor relations, an update on employee engagement, whatever it is. And then putting in place or doing some things which check in on that, which give you some personal insight and visibility as well. So whether that's, I mean, I'm sure we all talk to shareholders directly and get our own, hear it ourselves. We will go out on visits and talk to employees. So it's process, it's reports to the board, and then it's that getting your own insights as well.
Thank you. So it's a similar approach to other board issues, but absolutely. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and there's two sort of clusters of questions. One is about board composition, which I know was mentioned, and there are two sort of angles. One is a question from the chair of a large charity saying, is it more difficult for corporate boards to achieve the sort of diversity that perhaps charity boards do? And is there a risk of homogeneity on corporate boards, even if you do have sort of, gender balance, for example, that everybody's come from quite a similar corporate background? And then the second part of that question was, do you think that more diverse boards have a stronger reputational performance or lower reputational risk? So two dimensions to the reputational, to the diversity question and composition, board composition. Ian.
I don't have enough data about whether there's a correlation between greater diversity and reputation. I think that is, I mean, sometimes things, genuinely happen for totally unpredictable reasons. And even if you plan for them, take the power outages that I gave up. I don't know what we would have done differently. Roughly one of these things happens about every 10 years, actually. So it only happened once on my watch, so once on my predecessor's watch. But I think, I certainly think the question about charges and corporates, I think, if a board has got the mindset, and particularly the chairman, that she wants to build a diverse board, then you can do it. You might have to work a bit harder with some of the search consultants to ensure that they come up with the sort of range of diverse candidates you want. But I think that's what it starts with, what's in the mind of the search consultant's client when they begin the process of trying to find candidates. If you've got a relatively closed mind as a chairman about what levels of diversity you want on the board, then you probably won't end up with a very diverse board. I would just sort of go back to the praise. I think we've also got to be careful about, we cannot please all the stakeholders all of the time. Now, what a grid was involved in, it builds long lateral pieces of infrastructure, sometimes across previously unspoiled parts of the English countryside. You are never going to get local communities whose views are going to be ruined, who derive no benefit whatsoever from this piece of infrastructure, to be standing in the aisles cheering you. You've got to ensure that they're treated properly, that all the due processes are followed, and you go the extra miles to ensure that the consultations are met and all that. But at the end of the day, you've just got to realise they're not going to be happy bunnies. And HS2 are learning that, are going through that in spades at the moment. Grid is still going through a number of its projects. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to, unfortunately, the planning or the regulatory rules do not allow every overhead cable to be buried. The cost of doing it would be enormous and would have to be socialized across consumers who wouldn't be happy about increased bills being influenced by that sort of activity. So as soon as you start, the lines cannot be buried, they have to be overgrounded, then you're in trouble with those communities.
Yes, and clearly boards are where interests collide, and part of the role of the board is to navigate through that complexity, very much so. Ruth, did you want to add something to the diversity point?
Well, I think I agree with Peter. I think we've all had a lot of focus on diversity in terms of the more obvious aspects, so gender initially, and then ethnicity, and we've put a lot of focus on all the different skills that we want, and then there are different types of diversity. I think that different ways of thinking and different ways of approaching issues is really important as well. It's more difficult because we don't tend to, do cognitive assessments of potential board members to see how they're going to fit the team. But I think to the extent that you can judge some of these things from interacting with people, I'm very focused on trying to build in people who are going to look at problems differently from me. And I know from my own, I've talked to you about this, Gillian, before, from my own executive life, I used to quite consciously build teams with people who were very, very different from me, knowing that it would be a complete pain in the neck to work with them because they would keep seeing things in a different way. And I think that that is a really good thing. So I'm very much driven by that. And I do think and that is, of course, is absolutely the case for everything the board's doing. It's about the strategic decisions for business reasons and so on and so on. But on the point of reputation, I think it is about, you know, not unnecessarily scoring an own goal by just, you know, being all too much channel visioned to miss things. So Peter, when you are, you know, making decisions that are inevitably going to upset some stakeholder groups, you're doing it eyes wide open, and you can manage it as well as you can.
Thank you. And we've got a last sort of cluster of questions, and this is about the chair. So one question which comes from Stephen Page is, does the chair need a Twitter account, a personal Twitter account? But there's also a bigger question, and from Liz Peace, which is about, you know, there are times when companies need a presence in front of the media. Usually that's the CEO. Sometimes it's not appropriate for that to be the CEO. Should chairs have a strong media presence, be good media performers? The presence of the chair. Perhaps I can start with Ian on this one.
Yeah, well, I think the presence, I think it depends on the competence and capabilities of the chair and the CEO or the chief communications officer. I mean, some chair are very good at representing and some are not very good. Some CEOs are really good at it. So I think it depends on the situation. And there are certain situations, let's say you've got a crisis with the CEO, then I think the chair has to take the lead. If you get the CEO or chair, you're acknowledging it's very serious. So one of the choices is how high do you want to communicate? Once a chair has started communicating externally, it's quite difficult to row back. And if you're a non-executive chair, as opposed to a executive chair or hands-on chair. So I think it's very situational specific. I think it's very skill specific. And it just needs, but I think a good board would know how it's going to deal with that choice. Who's going to deal with this issue? A very good example would have been BP in the Gulf of Mexico crisis, where the CEO went to deal with it and got involved in the crisis. So the chair had to become the public figure. Had it not gone that way, it would have been a different outcome. So I think it's horses for courses on who deals with the media. And I think general rules are quite dangerous.
Thank you. But it's also something that you would recommend thinking that the board should have thought through in advance. And I
think a good board, just like it has a defense manual, would have a crisis response manual or process. And one of the issues would be who deals externally, who deals with what type of issue. It should be rehearsed as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Peter.
So I think the other thing I'd add, I mean, I think we would have to, I mean, if the chair or the non-exec chair started speaking publicly in America, you'd still get quite a lot of people who'd say, "What, you know, who on earth is a non-executive chair?" Given that, you know, we still have quite a lot of combination of chairs and chief executives who are combined in the States. So I think you also think about the context. But I mean, I agree with Ian. I mean, the default has to be that the lead spoke of the company should be the chief executive, unless for some reason the chief executive is either, I mean, not, you know, disabled, or is himself, you know, part of the story, and therefore cannot be the chief spokesman for the company. I mean, I personally, I would not have a social media presence. I mean, I believe that chairmen should be seen and out publicly, you know, not all that often, and should be heard even less. So I would never have a social media account.
Well, then we're very.
But then I haven't got one in my private life, so you know, my kids think I'm a dinosaur. But
thank you, Ruth. Anything to add on the presence of the chair?
I completely agree with what Peter has said and Ian has said. I think I mean, I think of it actually in the context of, the chair's role is to run the board and the CEO's role is to run the company. And, I think that if the issue at play is to do with the company and the company's operations and activities and so on, then you want the CEO to be the spokesperson, unless for any reason that doesn't work. If it's more to do with the board, then I think you have to be prepared then that it should be the chair. But strong preference for it to be the CEO.
Thank you.
I like seen and not heard.
Thank you. Well, then we're very lucky this afternoon to have 3 chairs voicing opinions. I am keeping an eye on the time, and I know in particular Ian needs to leave very promptly. And I've asked really to wrap up our webinar this afternoon for practical advice. And so, Ian, could I ask you to sort of just kick off this closing session? What would be your practical advice, perhaps to an incoming chair, thinking about reputational risk and preparing the board for reputational risk?
Well, perhaps 2 or 3 thoughts on that. It's not just the chairman, it's for the company. One is, have you discussed and agreed on how much reputation matters and with which stakeholders? So mapping the stakeholders, mapping the impact, deciding what is critical, what is annoying. By the way, we're talking always on the negative. We're always talking about crises and loss. We haven't talked about building a reputation, as though every company is fighting to hang on to it. Most companies have no reputation at all with anyone. So it's interesting we haven't talked about building a reputation, but whether you're building or protecting or defending, having mapped the stakeholders. Secondly, have you got data on the reputation with stakeholders? And thirdly, have you got clear processes and responsibilities for dealing with those stakeholders individually and collectively? So I would say that's the role of the board and the chair to ensure that that is done.
Thank you. And can I just come back on that one point? Have you found that at times you as a board member or as a chair are actually questioning the risk appetite? I mean, you raised the point that having a reputation is valuable. Having no reputation is sort of is not a great place to be. So do you find that you're questioning whether?
Yeah, you absolutely do, because as a general rule, boards are much more reputational risk averse than management. Most board members, the first thing they think about is the reputation of the company and of the board, and maybe sometimes, I'm afraid, even of themselves. Whereas management tends to think more about performance and the rest. So there's a natural human tension. I think it's very, very good to debate that. But absolutely, and it goes back to the diversity point that came up earlier. One of the things on diversity that I don't think is talked enough about is diversity of risk appetite. The idea that boards have a risk appetite, it's sort of a theory. The reality is individuals on boards have different risk appetites depending. So you cannot have this discussion without having a discussion about risk appetite. And some people are incredibly thick-skinned about reputational risk. It'll just pass, just like many journalists are thick-skinned about it. So to me, the interesting diversity is your appetite for risk on reputation rather than ethnic or gender.
Thank you. That's a dimension that's probably not very often spoken about. So thank you, Ian. Ruth, could I turn to you? So your practical recommendations for perhaps a chair or an incoming board member thinking about reputation, both risk and opportunity.
Well, so I come back to what I said in the opening remarks, which is, and I am very much thinking here about building reputation. And alongside that, I think check what your crisis management plans are and if everyone knows what they would do in a crisis. But in terms of building reputation, and actively wanting to do that, not least because I do think that the reputation of companies for employees, as I've said, is so important. So I think it is about purpose, it's about board process and openness, it's about diversity, it's about stakeholder management, and it's very much about culture. And they're not, they're the things that you'd probably be looking at anyway for all sorts of other reasons. But I think this is another very good reason to focus on those.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, those sort of implicitly, much of this is being done, as you say already, a good chair will do this implicitly, exactly. Peter, if I could turn to you and your practical recommendations, please.
But so I'd endorse everything that Ruth and Ian have said. I think I'd add one other thing, which is certainly for an incoming chair or board member now, is to ask what has happened to this company's reputation through the COVID emergency. Is it better than it was before the emergency, the same, or has it gone down? And particularly if it's improved as a result, to say what is being done to ensure that this new level of reputational performance creates a foundation for how you continue to improve reputation with your key stakeholder groups going forward and not regress. Because I think that overall will help, hopefully improve the reputation of corporate Britain, which, as we saw from one of your charts, is not very high at the moment.
Thank you. And I think, yes, I mean, we didn't mention in the charts, but obviously there's obviously the pandemic we've been through, and then the whole opening up of the future of work and the role that companies will play in bringing their employees back to work and engaging with their employees, and the opportunities, but also the reputational sensitivities around that. So I'd like to say thank you very much to our chairs, and I think we've just about made it on time. So I'm particularly to Ian for fitting us in and before the 3 o'clock close. And perhaps if we could just go back to the charts, Kate, and just to wrap up, we provided a summary of what we rather anticipated the chairs would say, that trust in business is challenged. ESG is certainly a reflection of society's expectations for companies, and stakeholders matter and have a voice, and shareholders care. A fast-moving media amplifies and intensifies the reputational impact, and the chair and the board have a key role in developing and restoring trust. And we've talked about the horizon scanning, the stakeholder engagement, building an effective board, and also just that oversight of having an effective executive team. And in many ways, this is part of what the chair does. It's not an exceptional, you know, as all 3 chairs have spoken, there is something very implicit of this is how building a good board, this is how a chair oversees the effectiveness of the company. So we will certainly be sharing, we've captured the key takeaways, and we'll be sharing those with you. And many thanks to our chairs for talking us through this provocative title, but I think one that's worked very well. And from our side, we're going into the summer, as I think everybody is right now. But if we could move to the next chart, please, Kate. And we'll be looking forward in the second half to seat at the table back at Hever Castle in person. So we are looking forward to re-engaging again. And the topic will be the role of the chair. And so really looking at, once again, at the role that the chair plays in an effective board. We'll also have a webinar later in September on strategy, the board's role in strategy and strategy formation. And we will keep you up to speed via Overture with updates on governance trends and also invitations to future webinars. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Peter and to Ruth, and we've lost Ian at this point. Really great insights and some practical structured thinking on how to work through reputational risk, building reputation, and also managing and keeping a calm head through a crisis. As I think Peter started off with a case study that those of us based in the UK will quite vividly remember as we tried to navigate Wandsworth roundabout with no traffic lights because of the outage. So I'd like to say thank you very much to our audience and also to our chairs for participating. And we'll follow up and make sure that you've all got the charts. Thank you very much indeed, and have a very safe and summer, and we look forward to reconnecting. Thank you. Many thanks. Bye-bye.